When was the radio invented?
The radio, or wireless, was born in 1895 when Italian physicist and inventor Guglielmo Marconi, 1874 to 1937, experimented with wireless telegraphy. The following year he transmitted telegraph signals, through the air, from Italy to England. By 1897 Marconi founded his own company, Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, Ltd. in London, and began setting up communication lines across the English Channel to France, which he accomplished in 1898. In 1900 Marconi established the American Marconi Company. He continued making improvements, including those that allowed for sending out signals on different wavelengths so that multiple messages could be transmitted at one time, without interfering with each other. The first transatlantic message, from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada, was sent and received in 1901. At first radio technology was regarded as a novelty and few understood how it could work. But in January 1901 a Marconi wireless station at South Wellfleet, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, received Morse code messages as well as faint music and voices from Europe. That event changed the perception of radio. Before long, Americans had become accustomed to receiving radiograms, messages transmitted via the wireless. In 1906 the first radio broadcast of voice and music was made. The event originated at Brant Rock, Massachusetts, on Christmas Eve, and the program was picked up by ships within a radius of several hundred miles. That accomplishment resulted from the invention of another radio pioneer, American engineer Reginald Fessenden. 1866 to 1932, who patented a high-frequency alternator. 1901, capable of generating continuous waves rather than intermittent impulses, it was the first successful radio transmitter. In 1910 American inventor Lee De Forest, 1873 to 1961, the father of radio. Broadcast opera singer Enrico Caruso's, 1873 to 1921, tenor voice over the airwaves. In 1916 De Forest transmitted the first radio news broadcast. Westinghouse station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the first corporately sponsored station, and the first broadcast station licensed on a frequency outside amateur bands. Within 3 years of its first commercial radio broadcast, which announced the election returns in the presidential race on November 2, 1920, Warren G. Harding won. There were more than 500 radio stations in the United States.
When was the radio invented?
The radio, or wireless, was born in 1895 when Italian physicist and inventor Guglielmo Marconi, 1874 to 1937, experimented with wireless telegraphy. The following year he transmitted telegraph signals, through the air, from Italy to England. By 1897 Marconi founded his own company, Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, Ltd. in London, and began setting up communication lines across the English Channel to France, which he accomplished in 1898. In 1900 Marconi established the American Marconi Company. He continued making improvements, including those that allowed for sending out signals on different wavelengths so that multiple messages could be transmitted at one time, without interfering with each other. The first transatlantic message, from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada, was sent and received in 1901. At first radio technology was regarded as a novelty and few understood how it could work. But in January 1901 a Marconi wireless station at South Wellfleet, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, received Morse code messages as well as faint music and voices from Europe. That event changed the perception of radio. Before long, Americans had become accustomed to receiving radiograms, messages transmitted via the wireless. In 1906 the first radio broadcast of voice and music was made. The event originated at Brant Rock, Massachusetts, on Christmas Eve, and the program was picked up by ships within a radius of several hundred miles. That accomplishment resulted from the invention of another radio pioneer, American engineer Reginald Fessenden. 1866 to 1932, who patented a high-frequency alternator. 1901, capable of generating continuous waves rather than intermittent impulses, it was the first successful radio transmitter. In 1910 American inventor Lee De Forest, 1873 to 1961, the father of radio. Broadcast opera singer Enrico Caruso's, 1873 to 1921, tenor voice over the airwaves. In 1916 De Forest transmitted the first radio news broadcast. Westinghouse station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the first corporately sponsored station, and the first broadcast station licensed on a frequency outside amateur bands. Within 3 years of its first commercial radio broadcast, which announced the election returns in the presidential race on November 2, 1920, Warren G. Harding won. There were more than 500 radio stations in the United States.
What is behaviorism?
Behaviorism is a school of psychology that attempts to explain human behavior in terms of responses to environmental stimuli, influenced by the conditioned reflex demonstrated by Russian physiologist Ivan Pavlov. 1849 to 1936, American psychologist John Broadus Watson, 1878 to 1958, of Johns Hopkins University, codified and popularized the theory, which discards introspection and consciousness as influences on human behavior. Behaviorism was further studied by another American psychologist and Harvard professor B. F. Skinner. 1904 to 1990, Skinner focused his work on patterns of responses to observable stimuli, versus unobservable stimuli such as introspection and conscience, and external rewards. Applied to human learning, Skinner's theories on behaviorism affected educational methods, which tangibly reward good behavior.
When was the radio invented?
The radio, or wireless, was born in 1895 when Italian physicist and inventor Guglielmo Marconi, 1874 to 1937, experimented with wireless telegraphy. The following year he transmitted telegraph signals, through the air, from Italy to England. By 1897 Marconi founded his own company, Marconi's Wireless Telegraph Company, Ltd. in London, and began setting up communication lines across the English Channel to France, which he accomplished in 1898. In 1900 Marconi established the American Marconi Company. He continued making improvements, including those that allowed for sending out signals on different wavelengths so that multiple messages could be transmitted at one time, without interfering with each other. The first transatlantic message, from Cornwall, England, to Newfoundland, Canada, was sent and received in 1901. At first radio technology was regarded as a novelty and few understood how it could work. But in January 1901 a Marconi wireless station at South Wellfleet, Massachusetts, on Cape Cod, received Morse code messages as well as faint music and voices from Europe. That event changed the perception of radio. Before long, Americans had become accustomed to receiving radiograms, messages transmitted via the wireless. In 1906 the first radio broadcast of voice and music was made. The event originated at Brant Rock, Massachusetts, on Christmas Eve, and the program was picked up by ships within a radius of several hundred miles. That accomplishment resulted from the invention of another radio pioneer, American engineer Reginald Fessenden. 1866 to 1932, who patented a high-frequency alternator. 1901, capable of generating continuous waves rather than intermittent impulses, it was the first successful radio transmitter. In 1910 American inventor Lee De Forest, 1873 to 1961, the father of radio. Broadcast opera singer Enrico Caruso's, 1873 to 1921, tenor voice over the airwaves. In 1916 De Forest transmitted the first radio news broadcast. Westinghouse station KDKA in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, was the first corporately sponsored station, and the first broadcast station licensed on a frequency outside amateur bands. Within 3 years of its first commercial radio broadcast, which announced the election returns in the presidential race on November 2, 1920, Warren G. Harding won. There were more than 500 radio stations in the United States.
What did Alfred Nobel do?
The Swedish chemist whose name is known around the world because of the Nobel Prize, invented dynamite, 1866. even though dynamite improved the safety of explosives. Alfred Nobel 1833 to 1896, became concerned with how his invention would be used. Nobel was a pacifist. He was involved in the explosives industry because it was his family's business. In his will, he set up a fund, bequeathing a sum of $9.2 million to reward people who make strides in the sciences, literature, and promoting international peace. He died in 1896, and the Nobel Prize has been awarded annually. Except for 1940 to 42, since 1901. Recipients in any of 5 categories: physics, chemistry, medicine/physiology, literature, and peace are presented with a gold medal, a diploma, and a substantial monetary award in the hundreds of thousands of US dollars for each laureate. A 6th related award is the prize in economic sciences in memory of Alfred Nobel, which was established in 1968 by the Swedish National Bank and was first awarded in 1969. The laureates are announced each year in October, and the prizes are handed out in ceremonies on December 10, the anniversary of Nobel's death.
What did Freud believe?
The Austrian neurologist believed that human behavior and all mental states are influenced by repressed and forgotten impressions, many of them from childhood. Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, further believed that by uncovering these impressions, collectively called a complex, he could effect a cure for his patient. Freud regarded infantile mental processes, including infantile sexuality, of particular importance to the unconscious, and therefore influential to human behavior. While he initially used hypnosis, a sleep-like state in which the patient is open to suggestion, as a method of revealing the unconscious, Freud later turned to a new form of treatment called free association. By this method, a patient talks about whatever is on his or her mind, jumping from one idea to the next. The memories and feelings that surface through free association are then analyzed by the therapist to find the root of the patient's mental or emotional problem. Freud also interpreted his patient's dreams, which he believed are unconscious representations of repressed desires. Free association and dream analysis are the cornerstones of psychoanalysis. In analyzing human behavior, Freud came to the conclusion that the mind, or psyche, is divided into 3 parts: the ID, the ego, and the superego. The ID is the source of instincts, the ego is the mediator between those instincts and reality, and the superego is the conscience. The superego functions to reward or punish through a system of moral attitudes and a sense of guilt. The theories of psychoanalysis hold that if the parts of the mind oppose each other, a mental or emotional disorder, called a neurosis, occurs. Freud's theories revolutionized the fields of psychiatry and psychology. They also influenced methods and philosophies of child rearing and education. while psychoanalysis has been credited with helping millions of mentally ill patients. Freud's theories have also been rejected or challenged by many.
Who was Enrico Fermi?
The Italian-born physicist Enrico Fermi, 1901 to 1954, was one of the chief architects of the nuclear age. In 1934 Fermi announced that he had discovered elements beyond uranium. But what he had really done, and which was later proved, was split the atom. In 1938, just before World War II, 1939 to 45, this process was named nuclear fission. And 1 year later, German-born physicist Albert Einstein, 1879 to 1955, would write a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882 to 1945, urging the American government to study this process, which releases energy. Also in 1938 Fermi was awarded the Nobel Prize in Physics and he escaped Italy, where the fascist regime of Benito Mussolini, 1883 to 1945, had taken hold. Fermi became a professor of physics at Columbia University in 1939, where he taught for 3 years. In 1942 he got involved in the Manhattan Project, which was developing the atomic bomb. In that capacity, he directed the first controlled nuclear chain reaction. After World War II, Fermi, who had become an American citizen in 1944, taught at the University of Chicago and continued his research on the basic properties of nuclear particles. In 1953 he had an element named after him, fermium, an artificially created radioactive element. The U.S. Atomic Energy Commission, AEC, honors accomplishments in physics with the Enrico Fermi Award.
Who invented the telegraph?
Though the invention came as the result of several decades of research by many people, Samuel F. B. Morse, 1791 to 1872, is credited with making the first practical telegraph, the first instrument that could send messages across wires via electricity, in 1837. Morse was a portrait painter in Boston when he became interested in magnetic telegraphy in about 1832. With technical assistance from chemistry professor Leonard Gale. 1800 to 1883, and financial support from Alfred Vail, 1807 to 1859, Morse conducted further experiments. He also developed Morse code, a system of variously arranged dots and dashes, which can be used to transmit messages. For example, the most frequently used letter of the alphabet is E, which is rendered in Morse code by using one dot. The less frequently used Z is rendered by two dashes followed by two dots. By 1837 Morse had demonstrated the telegraph to the public in New York, Philadelphia, and Washington, D.C. He received a patent for his invention in the United States in 1840. In 1843 his invention got a boost when the U.S. Congress approved an experimental line to be built between Washington, D.C., and Baltimore, Maryland. The following year, on May 24, 1844, Morse sent his first message across that line, "What hath God wrought?" Vail was on the receiving end of the wire. By 1861 most major U.S. cities were linked by telegraph wires. The first successful transatlantic cables were laid in 1866. Morse code transmissions, called telegraphs when transmitted via above-ground wires, and cablegrams, or cables, when transmitted via underwater cables, were translated by operators or mechanical printers on both the sending and receiving ends of the message. The introduction of the telegraph marked the beginning of modern communications. When the first transcontinental telegraph line in the United States was completed on October 24, 1861, it eliminated the need for the Pony Express, which had briefly enjoyed the status of the fastest way to transmit a message about 8 days from St. Louis, Missouri, to Sacramento, California, a distance that could be bridged by telegraph lines within minutes. The telegraph became the chief means of long-distance communication. The telephone, invented 1875, which allows voice transmission over electrical wires, gradually replaced the telegraph. But for many decades the two technologies were both in use.
Why did Einstein write to President Roosevelt urging U.S. development of the atom bomb?
Albert Einstein, who was born in Germany in 1879 and was educated in Switzerland, where he also became a naturalized citizen, was an ardent pacifist. But, being a brilliant observer, he quickly perceived the threat posed by Nazi Germany. Einstein was visiting England in 1933 when the Nazis confiscated his property in Berlin and deprived him of his German citizenship. Some might call it lucky that the Nobel Prize-winning, 1921, scientist was out of the country. When this happened in the coming years, other Jews certainly suffered worse fates as Nazi Germany. Under despotic ruler Adolf Hitler, 1889–1945, persecuted and killed more than 6 million Jews. Einstein moved to the United States, where he took a position at the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey. There he settled and later became an American citizen, 1940. In August 1939, just before Adolf Hitler's German troops invaded Poland and began World War II. 1939–45, Einstein wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, 1882–1945, urging him to launch a government program to study nuclear energy. He further advocated the United States build an atomic bomb, cautioning that such an effort might already be underway in Germany. The United States did in fact begin development of the atomic bomb, which releases nuclear energy by splitting heavy atomic particles. The program was called the Manhattan Project, and it was centered at Oak Ridge, Tennessee, and Hanford, Washington, where scientists worked to obtain sufficient amounts of plutonium and uranium to make the bombs. The bombs themselves were developed in a laboratory in Los Alamos, New Mexico. The project was funded by the government to the tune of $2 billion. The first atomic device, made of plutonium, was tested in Alamogordo, New Mexico. On July 16, 1945. And less than a month later the United States dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima. August 6, and Nagasaki, August 9, Japan, forcing the Japanese to surrender. After the war, Einstein, who was always interested in world and human affairs, and had regretted the death and destruction in Japan, advocated a system of world law that he believed could prevent war in the atomic, or nuclear, age. A Zionist Jew, in 1952 he was offered the presidency of the relatively new State of Israel. Founded 1947, but he declined the honor. He died in New Jersey in 1955.
Did Henry Ford invent the automobile?
No, while Henry Ford, 1863 to 1947, transformed American industry and changed the way we travel, live, and work, he did not invent the automobile. Just before the turn of the century, there were several inventors who were tinkering with gas-powered vehicles. And by the time Ford had finished his first working car, the Duryea brothers, Charles, 1861 to 1938, Frank, 1869 to 1967, had demonstrated the first successful gas-powered car in the United States. An Ohio-born inventor Ransom Eli Olds, 1864 to 1950, already had a car, the Oldsmobile, in production. Even prior to the work of these American inventors and entrepreneurs, Europeans had made strides in developing the automobile. The automobile is the result of a series of inventions, which began in 1769 when French military engineer Nicolas-Joseph Cugnot, 1725 to 1804, built a steam-powered road vehicle. In the early 1800s other inventors also experimented with this idea, and the steam-powered vehicle was put into production, both in Europe and the United States. In 1899 William McKinley, 1843 to 1901, became the first U.S. president to ride in a car, a Stanley steamer. Built by twin brothers Francis, 1849 to 1918, and Freeland, 1849 to 1940, Stanley. A breakthrough in developing gas-powered automobiles came in 1860, when an internal combustion engine was patented by Frenchman Etienne Lenoir, 1822 to 1900. But the car as we know it was born in 1885 when Germans Gottlieb Daimler, 1834-1900, and Carl Benz, 1844 to 1929, working independently of each other, developed the forerunners of the gas engines used today. In 1891 to 1892, French company Panhard et Levasseur designed a front-engine, rear-wheel drive automobile. This concept remained relatively unchanged for nearly 100 years. Until 1900, Europeans led the world in the development and production of automobiles. In 1896, the Duryea Motor Wagon Company turned out the United States' first production motor vehicle. The gas-powered cars were available for purchase that same year. The development of the car was helped by advances in rubber and in the development of pneumatic tires during the 19th century, with names like Charles Goodyear, American. 1800-60, John Boyd Dunlop, Scottish, 1840-1921, and the Michelin brothers, French. André, 1853-1931, and Edouard, 1859-1940, figuring prominently in automotive history. Even after the gas engine was invented, which was ultimately more efficient than the steam engine, the car's development continued along parallel tracks. About 1891, American William Morrison successfully developed an electric car. Electric cars were soon put into production, and by the turn of the century they accounted for just less than 40% of all American car sales.
How did Charles Darwin develop his theory of evolution?
The English naturalist Charles Darwin, 1809-1882, was attending Cambridge when, through a friend, he gained appointment as naturalist aboard the HMS Beagle. The around-the-world voyage began in 1831, and Darwin was able to gather data on flora, fauna, and geology in the world's southern lands, the South American coasts, the Galapagos, the Andes Mountains, Australia, and Asia. The trip lasted into 1836, and in the years that followed Darwin published and edited many works on natural history, though none of them put forth his theory of evolution. It's interesting to note that Darwin's paternal grandfather, Erasmus Darwin (1731–1802), was a physician, botanist, and poet, who in 1803 wrote verse that he titled, "The Temple of Nature, or the Origin of Society," which anticipated the theory of evolution that his grandson would put forth. Encouraged by Sir Charles Lyell, 1797–1875, who is considered the father of modern geology, Charles Darwin wrote out his theory. Coincidentally, he received the abstract of an identical theory of natural selection, formulated by English naturalist Alfred Russel Wallace, 1823–1913, who had arrived at his conclusions independently of Darwin. Wallace had made his formulation of evolution based on his study of comparative biology in Brazil's Amazon River and the East Indies, Malay Archipelago. In 1858, Darwin published both his work as well as the abstract written by Wallace. The following year he backed up his theory in On the Origin of Species by Means of Natural Selection, which was found to be scientifically credible. It was widely read by the public. which snatched up so many copies that the first printing of the first edition sold out in only one day. Darwin added to this work with The Descent of Man in 1871. What Darwin put forth was that all life originated with a simple primordial protoplasm, the fundamental material of which all living things are composed. In his theory of natural selection, Darwin posited that those species that are best adapted to the environment are the species that survive and reproduce. While organic evolution and natural selection had a profound impact on the world of science, which further studied and supported the concepts, they jarred much of the religious community and created a controversy. Creationists, who believe the origin story put forth in the Bible, the story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, objected to Darwin's theories. Debate between evolution and creationism ensued, most notably in the so-called Scopes monkey trial of July 1925, Dayton, Tennessee. Public school teacher John T. Scopes, 1900 to 1970, was charged with violating a state law that prohibited the teaching of evolution. He was defended by one of the most acclaimed attorneys of all time, Clarence Darrow, 1857 to 1938. But the prosecution was led by another prominent lawyer, William Jennings Bryan, 1860 to 1925, and Scopes lost the case. But Scopes was later released on a technicality. The law was eventually repealed, in 1967. Though scientific research has largely substantiated the theory of evolution described by Charles Darwin, the theory of creation still has its followers, mostly religious fundamentalists.
How old is philosophy?
Philosophy, apart from religion, emerged in the East and the West at about the same time, roughly 600 years before Christ, before the Common Era. It was then that thinkers in Greece began questioning the nature of existence. And it was c. 500 BC when Confucianism was formulated in China. Philosophy has long been intertwined with religion, including Hinduism, which developed about 1500 BC. But as a pursuit of wisdom in and of itself, philosophy is roughly 2600 years old. Western philosophy is divided into three major periods: ancient, c. 600 BC, AD 400. Medieval philosophy, often called scholasticism, which also included Eastern thinkers, 400s to 1600s, and modern philosophy, since the 1600s.
Why was Oppenheimer investigated for disloyalty to the United States?
American physicist J. Robert Oppenheimer, 1904 to 1967, who had directed the Los Alamos, New Mexico laboratory where the first atomic bomb was developed and built, was investigated by the government in 1953 and 1954 because of his opposition to the United States development of a hydrogen bomb. He was also suspected of having ties with the Communist Party, and therefore was viewed as a security risk. Following World War II, 1939–45, Oppenheimer, seeing the devastating and awesome power of the atomic bomb his laboratory had created, became a vocal advocate of international control of atomic energy. When the United States began developing the hydrogen bomb, also called a thermonuclear bomb because of the high temperatures that it requires in order to create a reaction, Oppenheimer objected on both moral and technical grounds. The hydrogen bomb is a far more destructive weapon than the atomic bomb. In 1953, Oppenheimer was suspended from the U.S. Atomic Energy Commission (AEC), because he was believed to pose a threat to national security. Hearings were held, but the New York-born scientist was cleared of charges of disloyalty. A decade later, in 1963, the organization gave Oppenheimer its highest honor, the Enrico Fermi Award, for his contributions to theoretical physics. Indeed, Oppenheimer had done much to further the science during his lifetime. As a member of the faculty of the University of California at Berkeley, he established a center for research in theoretical physics. He also taught at the California Institute of Technology, and he served as director of the Institute for Advanced Study in Princeton, New Jersey, from 1947 to 1966. There he knew German-born physicist Albert Einstein. 1879 to 1955, who accepted a position at the Institute in 1933 and remained there until his death in 1955.
Who was Typhoid Mary?
Typhoid Mary was the name given to Mary Mallon, c. 1870 to 1938, the first known carrier of typhoid fever in the United States. Though Mallon had recovered from the disease, as a cook in New York City area restaurants she continued to spread typhoid fever germs to others, infecting more than 50 people between 1900 and 1915. The New York State Sanitation Department connected her to at least 6 typhoid fever outbreaks there. Officials finally and permanently institutionalized her in 1914 to prevent further spread of the acute infectious disease.
When did rail service in the United States reach from coast to coast?
On May 10, 1869, the last tracks of the United States' first cross-country railroad were laid, making North America the first continent to be spanned from coast to coast by a rail line. The event was the fulfillment of a great national dream to knit the vast country closer together. Short-run rail lines had been in use since the 1840s, but the nation lacked a method for transporting people, raw materials, and finished goods between distant regions. In the early 1860s, U.S. Congress decided in favor of extending the railroad across the country. The federal government granted land and extended millions of dollars in loans to 2 companies to complete the project. After a long debate that had become increasingly sectional, the legislature had earlier determined the railroad should run roughly along the 42nd parallel from Omaha, Nebraska, to Sacramento, California. This route was settled on for its physical properties. The topography of the landscape would best allow the ambitious project. The Union Pacific Railroad was to begin work in Omaha and lay tracks westward. The Central Pacific Railroad was to begin in Sacramento and lay tracks eastward, crossing the Sierra Nevada mountains. Work began in 1863, and 6 years later the two projects met at Promontory in north-central Utah, northwest of Ogden. The Central Pacific Railroad laid 689 miles of track eastward from Sacramento, while the Union Pacific Railroad laid 1,086 miles of track westward from Omaha. 600 workers, including numerous Irish, Chinese, and Mexican immigrant workers, attended the May 10, 1869, ceremony celebrating the accomplishment. The last steel spike that was driven into the railroad was wired to a telegraph line. When the spike was pounded, a signal was sent around the world to announce the completion of the first transcontinental railroad. By the end of the 1800s, 15 rail lines crossed the nation.
When was the bicycle invented?
A series of inventions during the 1800s resulted, in 1876, in the introduction of the safety bicycle, the direct ancestor of the modern bike and the first commercially successful bicycle. It had wheels that were equal in size, making it easier and safer to ride than its high-wheeler predecessor. The bikes proliferated. By 1900 more than 10 million Americans owned bicycles. As with other inventions, the bicycle was the result of the work of several innovators. In 1817 German Baron Karl Friedrich Freiherr von Drais de Sauerbrunn, 1785 to 1851, developed a device that resembled a scooter. Named for its inventor, the Draisienne, later improved by Scotsman Kirkpatrick Macmillan. 1813 to 1878, who in 1839 added pedals to the vehicle, giving the world the first real bicycle. In 1870 English inventor James Starley, 1830 to 1881, designed a bicycle with a large front wheel and small rear wheel. Named the Ariel, the invention was also called a penny farthing. After two very different sized British coins, the high wheeler, and the ordinary. Though the bicycle was easier to pedal and faster, one revolution of the pedals turned the front wheel once. Its high center of gravity made it unstable and even dangerous. The innovation of the tricycle, or velocipede, improved the design of the Ariel by giving it the added stability of the third wheel. But it was not until the safety bike was developed in 1876 that the bicycle's popularity took off.
Invented by Englishman Henry John Lawson, 1852.
The bicycle had wheels of equal size and a bike chain, to drive the rear wheel. This practical design was improved again in 1895 when air-filled, pneumatic, tires were added. Mass production of the safety bicycle began in 1885. Even after the advent of the automobile, the bicycle continued to figure prominently in everyday life. In the United States, bicycle riding became a leisure pursuit that rivaled baseball in popularity. Cycling clubs emerged. The tandem. The bicycle built for two, allowed American youths an opportunity for courtship. Further, the bicycle industry produced some of the great innovators in transportation, including bicycle designer Charles Duryea, 1861–1938, who, with his brother Frank, 1869–1967, demonstrated the first successful gas-powered car in the United States, and brothers Wilbur, 1867–1912, and Orville, 1871–1948, Wright, who were the first to successfully build and fly an airplane.
Has the flu reached epidemic proportions?
Yes, influenza, also called the grippe, a contagious virus, has reached worldwide epidemic proportions 3 times in the 20th century alone. An epidemic occurred in 1918 and lasted into the next year. 20 million people died across the globe, including 500,000 Americans. Many of these deaths occurred as a result of secondary infections in patients whose immune systems were weakened by the flu. The advent of antibiotics, which became commercially available in 1945, helped prevent any subsequent flu outbreak from becoming so deadly. From 1957 to 1958, the Asian flu caused a worldwide epidemic. And from 1968 to 1969, the Hong Kong flu spread quickly to cause an epidemic. But dramatically fewer deaths were caused in these years due to the availability of antibiotics to control secondary infections.
How did Carl Sagan popularize science?
Carl Sagan, 1934–1996, a Cornell University astronomy and space science professor, became known to many Americans via his 13-part television program, Cosmos, which first aired on public broadcasting service PBS affiliates in the fall of 1980. The show covered a variety of science topics, including the origin and evolution of life on Earth, the evolution of the human brain, black holes, time travel, space exploration, and the ultimate fate of the universe. The program did so well for a while, ranking as the highest-rated regular series in public television history, that it also spun off a book by the same name. Cosmos, the book, became a bestseller and is still in print.
Who was Dolly the sheep?
Dolly was the first mammal cloned from the DNA of an adult animal. She was a Finn Dorset sheep born in 1996 and was hailed as a monumental scientific breakthrough when her birth was announced in early 1997. Scientists at Scotland's Roslin Institute used somatic cell nuclear transfer (SCNT), a reproductive cloning method, to produce the lamb, which carried the same nuclear DNA as the donor sheep. The cells were taken from the donor's udders. Dolly made headlines around the world and launched a public debate about the possibilities and ethics of cloning. Over the years, research groups around the world reported the cloning of mice, rats, cows, goats, rabbits, pigs, a horse, a mule, and a dog. In 2003, Dolly was put to sleep, though she lived only about half the expected 10 to 12-year lifespan for a Finn Dorset sheep. Scientists who conducted a post-mortem examination of her found that other than her ailments, arthritis and lung cancer, she appeared to be normal. The celebrity sheep was the mother of 6 lambs, which were brought into the world the old-fashioned way.
Who invented the hot air balloon?
French papermakers Joseph Michel, 1740–1810, and Jacques Etienne, 1745–1799. Montgolfier built the first practical balloon filled with hot air. On June 5, 1783, the Montgolfiers launched a large balloon at a public gathering in Annonay, France. It ascended for 10 minutes. 3 months later, they sent a duck, a sheep, and a rooster up in a balloon, and the animals were landed safely. This success prompted the Montgolfiers to attempt to launch a balloon carrying a human. In October 1783, French scientist Jean-François Pilatre de Roger, 1756–1785, became the first person to make a balloon ascent, but the balloon was held captive, for safety. The following month he became one of 2 men to make the first free flight in a hot air balloon, which ascended to a height of about 300 feet over Paris on November 21, 1783, and drifted over the city for about 25 minutes. Hot air ballooning, which proved to be better than the rival hydrogen-filled balloon developed in France at about the same time, became very popular in Europe. In January 1785, hot air balloonists successfully crossed the English Channel from Dover, England, to Calais, France. Across the Atlantic, hot air balloons made their debut in the United States in Philadelphia in 1793 before a crowd that included George Washington, 1732–1799, who was then President of the United States.
Who invented the telephone?
For more than 100 years, Alexander Graham Bell, 1847–1922, was credited with inventing the telephone. But in 2002 the U.S. Congress officially recognized a previously unknown Italian-American inventor. Antonio Musi, 1808 to 1889, as the father of the telephone. Musi was born in Florence, Italy, and arrived in the United States in 1845. His focus was the use of electricity in medicine. But in carrying out his experiments, he realized that the voice could be transmitted over wire. By 1862 he had developed dozens of models of his invention, but could not afford to protect his prototypes with patents. In 1870 illness forced the poor inventor to sell his early models. By 1874 he had assembled new models, which he gave to an executive at Western Union Telegraph Company. 2 years later, the announcement was made that Scottish-born inventor Alexander Graham Bell had pioneered the technology. Bell came to the United States in 1871 as a teacher of speech to the deaf. He believed that sound wave vibrations could be converted into electric current at one end of a circuit, and the current could be reconverted into identical sound waves at the other end of the circuit. He had described this idea to his father as early as 1874, and some believe that he may have conceived of it as early as 1865. Still, Musi's prototypes would have predated these ideas. On June 3, 1875, while trying to perfect a method for simultaneously carrying more than 2 messages over a single telegraph line, Bell heard the sound of a pluck spring along 60 feet of wire. In 1876 the first voice transmission via wire was made when Bell had a laboratory accident and called out to his assistant, "Watson, please come here. I want you." Thomas Watson. 1854 to 1934, was on another floor of the building, with the receiving apparatus, and distinctly heard Bell's message. That same year, the Bell telephone was patented in the United States and exhibited at the Philadelphia Centennial Exposition. Musi died in poverty in 1889. His recognition as the father of telephony was the result of persistence on the part of Italian Americans who wished to set the record straight. In fact, in 1871, 5 years earlier than Bell's first voice communication, Musi had secured a certificate stating his paternity to the invention of the telephone, which he called the teletrophone.
What was the first disease conquered by human beings?
Smallpox was the first disease eradicated by medicine, caused by a virus spread from person to person through the air. Smallpox was one of the most feared diseases and there was no treatment for it. Before the discovery of the New World, smallpox epidemics swept across Africa, Asia, and Europe, leaving victims scarred and or blind, and killing countless millions. When explorers set out to find new trade routes and landed in North and South America, they brought the disease with them, infecting the indigenous peoples. But once a person had the disease, he or she would not contract it again. This and other observations led British physician Edward Jenner 1749 to 1823 to develop a successful vaccine against the disease. Prior to the vaccine, the only preventive method was inoculation of the disease itself, which sometimes led to further spread of the disease. For example, in 1777 American General George Washington 1732 to 1799, obtained congressional approval to inoculate the entire Continental Army against smallpox, but the results were mixed. After its discovery in 1798, the use of Jenner's vaccine quickly spread. The first vaccine given in the United States was in 1799 by a Harvard physician. During the 1800s, many countries passed laws requiring vaccination. Improvements in the vaccine resulted in the elimination of smallpox from Europe and North America by the 1940s. When the World Health Organization, WHO, was created by the United Nations in 1946. One of its aims was to reduce the instances of smallpox around the world. Immunization programs brought this about. The last natural occurrence of the disease was reported in October 1977 in Somalia, Africa. When no further cases were documented within the next 2 years, the disease was considered eradicated.
Who are the leakies?
The prominent British family has included 4 scientists who have made significant anthropological findings in East Africa. Family patriarch Louis S. B. Leakey, 1903 to 1972, was born near Nairobi, Kenya. The oldest child of British missionaries. There he grew up, learning the tribal language of the Kikuyu people before he learned English and wandering the countryside, where he discovered primitive stone arrowheads and tools. While attending Cambridge University, Leakey determined that he would pursue a career in archaeology. And he went on to earn his doctorate degree. Louis Leakey married archaeologist and artist Mary Douglas, 1913 to 1996, in 1936. Returning to Leakey's boyhood home to conduct their work. The husband and wife team made their first discovery of note in 1948. Near Lake Victoria, Kenya, they found more than 30 fragments of the skull of an ape-like creature. Scientists concluded that the animal was a common ancestor of humankind and apes and had lived between 25 and 40 million years ago. The Leakeys made their most well-known discoveries in neighboring Tanzania during the late 1950s and into the 1960s, proving that human evolution was centered in Africa. At the Olduvai Gorge, a 35-mile-long ravine, the archaeologists discovered layers of Earth's history, including almost 100 forms of extinct animal life. They also unearthed the fossils of a near man, Zinjanthropus, who possessed a brain about half the size of the modern human and who walked upright at a height of about 5 feet, roughly 1.75 million years ago. Because he lived on a diet of nuts and meat, the discovery came to be called Nutcracker Man. Subsequent findings at the gorge included that of Homo habilis, called able man. Since it is believed that he made use of the stone tools found nearby. Louis Leakey later decided the two human-like creatures, able man and nutcracker man, had actually lived in the same place at the same time, meaning that the evolution of humankind was not along the linear path that had been thought. While Leakey's controversial conclusion challenged the scientific community, so would the finds of their scientist son Richard, 1944. In the decades that followed his parents' discoveries at Olduvai Gorge, Richard pursued his own projects at Lake Turkana in north-central Kenya. There Richard discovered more than 200 early man fossils. Like his father, Richard Leakey is part of a husband and wife team of scientists. In 1971 he married British-born Maeve Epps, 1942. A zoologist and paleontologist who had been hired by Louis Leakey in 1965 to work on his African digs. Together Richard and Maeve Leakey, along with American anthropologist Alan Walker, have discovered and identified some of the oldest known human-like fossils. In 1994 and 1995, near Lake Turkana, the team found prehistoric fossils identified as Australopithecus anamnesis, human-like creatures that lived about 4 million years ago.
When did the first jet airplane take flight?
The aviation event took place in 1939 in Germany, just as World War II was beginning. The development of the jet aircraft was made possible by British inventor Frank Whittle. 1907 to 1996, who built the first successful jet engine in 1937, the Germans copied Whittle's design. The engine propels an object forward by discharging a jet of heated air or exhaust gases rearward. Whittle's company, Powerjets Limited, built the engine for Britain's first jet plane in 1941, which became the model for early U.S. jets. During World War II, Great Britain, the United States, and Germany all employ jets, though in limited numbers, in their military operations. After the war ended, 1945, aircraft manufacturers began developing jet airliners. The innovator in the field was the de Havilland Aircraft Company, founded 1920, which produced the Comet, the first commercial jet. The aircraft was used by British Overseas Airways Corporation, now British Airways, which in 1952 initiated passenger flights. But flaws in the Comet's structure were later discovered to be the cause of several mid-air explosions. The craft was redesigned, and in 1958 British Airways launched transatlantic passenger service using the improved Comets. U.S. jet airplane passenger service was introduced by American Airlines in 1959. The airline used the Boeing Company's 707 to transport passengers from New York City to Los Angeles.
What does Jungian mean?
Jungian refers to the analytical psychology founded by Swiss psychiatrist Carl Gustav Jung, 1875 to 1961. Early in his career Jung conducted experiments in mental association and through this work came into contact with famed psychoanalyst Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, in 1907. While initially in harmony with each other, Jung later broke with Freud's theories, establishing his own doctrines of human behavior. Like Freud, Jung believed that the unconscious, that part of the mind of which a person is unaware, affects human behavior. But unlike his Austrian colleague, Jung denied that neuroses have any sexual basis. Instead, Jung believed that many factors influence human behavior, including the personalities of one's parents. He also believed in something he described as the collective unconscious. In his revolutionary work Psychology of the Unconscious, published in 1912, Jung asserted that there are two dimensions of the unconscious, the personal and the collective. The collective unconscious, according to Jung, is made up of those acts and mental patterns that are shared by members of a culture or are perhaps universally shared by all humankind. He theorized that the collective unconscious manifests itself in archetypes, images, patterns, and symbols that appear in dreams and fantasies as well as in mythology, religion, and literature. Jung believed that the collective unconsciousness can serve as a guide to humanity and therefore, he taught that therapy should make people aware of it. Jung's theories of archetypes, or universal symbols, have influenced such diverse fields as anthropology, art, filmmaking, and history. Jung later developed a system for classifying personalities into introverted and extroverted types, and distinguishing among mental functions, classifying them as thinking, feeling, sensing, or intuitive. Jung taught that therapists should help their patients balance introversion, relying only on oneself for personal fulfillment, with extroversion, relying on others for personal fulfillment. Jung's system of classifications, or typology, has been used to develop theories of personality types and their influences on human behavior.
What is philosophy?
From the Greek philo, meaning love of, and Sophia, meaning wisdom, philosophy is literally a love of wisdom. In practice, it is the pursuit of understanding the human condition, how, why, and what it means to exist or to be. Philosophers use methods such as observation and questioning to discern the truth. Philosophy is traditionally divided between Eastern thought and Western thought. Further, Western thought consists of 5 branches: metaphysics, concerned with the nature of the universe or of reality; logic, the laws of reasoning; epistemology, the nature of knowledge and the process by which knowledge is gained; ethics, the moral values or rules that influence human conduct; and aesthetics, the nature of beauty or the criteria for art.
Why is the equation E equals mc2 historically significant?
The famous equation was put forth in 1905 by German-born physicist and Nobel laureate. 1921, Albert Einstein, 1879 to 1955, and became important to history largely because it, along with the quantum theory, developed by Max Planck in 1900, laid the foundation for nuclear energy. It is part of Einstein's theory of relativity, 1905, 1916. In the formula, E is energy, m is mass, and c squared is a constant factor equal to the speed of light squared. The equation illustrates the relationship between, and exchangeability of, energy and matter. In the 1930s, when scientists discovered a way to split atoms, the minute particles of which elements are made, they learned that the subatomic particles that were created have a total mass less than the mass of the original atom. In other words, when the atom was split, part of the mass of the atom had been changed into subatomic particles, but some of it had been converted into energy. Using Einstein's formula E equals mc2, the scientists calculated how much energy was produced by splitting an atom. This atom splitting method for creating energy is the basis for nuclear energy. The term nuclear refers to the atomic process, which uses the nucleus or central portion of an atom to release energy. Today, we live in the nuclear age, where power and weapons are produced using the atomic process for creating energy.
What is the plague?
The plague is a general term that refers to any contagious epidemic disease, but usually refers specifically to bubonic plague, which gets its name from the swelling of the lymph nodes, or buboes. A bubonic plague epidemic spread throughout Europe and Asia in the middle of the 14th century, killing as much as 75% of the population in 20 years. That epidemic came to be known as the Black Death, an acute infectious disease. The bubonic plague is carried to humans by fleas that have bitten infected rats and other rodents. Human symptoms include high fever, chills, swelling of the lymph nodes, and hemorrhages. Once the bacteria spreads to the lungs, it is quickly fatal. This form of the disease is called pneumonic plague, and can be transmitted from person to person via droplets. Improved sanitation, chiefly in developed nations, has reduced the occurrence of the disease. Bubonic plague still occurs, but the development of antibiotics in the 20th century has greatly reduced the mortality rate.
How long have trains been in use?
Trains date as far back as the 16th century, when crude railroads operated in the underground coal and iron ore mines of Europe. These systems consisted of two wooden rails that extended into the mines and across the mine floors. Wheeled wagons were pulled along the rails by men or by horses. Early in the 18th century, mining companies expanded on this rail system, bringing it above ground to transport the coal and iron ore. Workers found that they could cover the wooden rails with iron so they wouldn't wear out as quickly. Before long, rails were made entirely of iron. Meanwhile, the steam engine had been developed. An engineer in the mines of Cornwall, England, Richard Trevithick, 1771 to 1833, constructed a working model of a locomotive engine in 1797. 3 years later, he built the first high-pressure steam engine. He made quick progress from there, building a road carriage, which on Christmas Eve 1801 became the first vehicle to convey passengers by steam. 2 years later, the inventor had built the world's first steam railway locomotive. In 1825, progress in rail transportation was made by another English inventor, George Stephenson, 1781 to 1848, who, after patenting his own locomotive engine, 1815, finished construction on the world's first public railroad. The train ran a distance of about 20 miles, conveying passengers from Stockton to Darlington, England. In 1830, Stephenson completed a line between Liverpool and Manchester. Rail travel caught on quickly and remains an efficient means of transport today, with commuters around the world relying on trains to get them to work each day. While Stephenson went on to build more railways, and build a family business in the process. Trevithick did not fare nearly as well, though he later found other uses for the high-pressure steam engine, including rock boring, dredging, and agriculture. He died penniless.